Think of the American literature canon, the first book that comes to mind for me is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. I had to read this book in my sophomore year of high school, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. The book itself was written in 1937 and covers a variety of different themes, from loneliness to dreams and even sacrifice. So let's talk about the basics. What is this story about? Of Mice and Men takes place on a ranch in Soledad, California during the Great Depression. Our two main characters include George Milton and Lenny Small, two ranch workers who hop from one ranch to the other in search of work. George is described as small and quick, dark of face, with restless eyes and sharp, strong features, while Lenny is described as a huge man, shapeless of face, with large, pale eyes and wide, sloping shoulders. Steinbeck also shows us something else about Lenny. While it's never outright said, it can be inferred that Lenny is mentally retarded, and this causes some problems for the two of them. See, Lenny likes soft things, such as rabbits, but often struggles to control his own strength, which is part of the reason why they're looking for work. Shortly after meeting these two, we learn that both of them share one dream, the dream of one day owning their own ranch. Lenny, particularly, just wants to tend to the rabbits, and believes that George is the person that can make it happen. When the boys arrive on the ranch, they meet a colorful cast of different characters. They meet an old ranch hand named Candy, an aggressive man by the name of Curly, Curly's wife, a stable hand named Crooks, another ranch hand named Carlson, another ranch hand named Slim, and a few others. While there, Candy overhears a conversation between the two boys about the farm. He offers up his life savings to help them get to the farm as long as the boys promise to let him live with them. It's here where George begins to think of the farm as more of a reality instead of just a dream. Shortly after this, Slim's dog gives birth, and he promises to give Lenny one of the puppies. He also promises to give Candy one, but only after Carlson shoots Candy's dog. Later, Curly tries to pick a fight with Lenny, which results in Curly's hand being injured. After this, the gang heads out to the local brothel. Lenny stays behind and hangs out with Crooks. While hanging out, Curly's wife walks in and proceeds to flirt with both of them. They remain unmoved, and Curly's wife realizes that Lenny is the reason for Curly's broken hand. The next day, Lenny is in the barn with his new puppy, which he accidentally kills. Curly's wife tries to consult him, to which he admits his love for soft things. Curly's wife then offers him to let her feel her hair. When he grabs on too hard, she lets out a cry. In an effort to silence her, he accidentally breaks her neck. Lenny flees, and as word breaks out around the ranch, the men form a lynching party. George finds Lenny first and tells him all about the farm and the rabbits that Lenny can tend to. While he's describing the rabbits, though, George pulls out a gun and shoots Lenny in the head, out of mercy. Now that we have the basics out of the way, let's talk about what we can learn from the book. Most, if not all of us, know that the Great Depression hit right after the Roaring Twenties. During 1929, the stock market crashed and burned, sending America into the biggest dumpster fire of them all. John Steinbeck wrote many works during the Great Depression, the two most notable being Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath. Steinbeck took inspiration from the Depression itself, and both of these works give us a unique and accurate look inside the time period. In a Set News article titled The Harvest Gypsies, John Steinbeck describes the conditions in which migrant workers not only worked in, but lived in. He says, "In their heads, as they move wearily from harvest to harvest, there is one urge and one overwhelmingly need to acquire a little land again, and to settle on it and stop their wandering." We see this in Of Mice and Men, specifically with George and Lenny. The two wander from town to town in search of work with a shared dream in mind, the dream of one day owning a farm and no longer needing to search for work. In another article, Steinbeck talks about how large farms in California got away with cheap labor and how it affects the migrant workers. He states, "The arrival of a migrant on such a ranch is something like this. He assigned a house for his family. He may have from 3 to 6 children, but they must all live in one room. The will of the ranch owner, then, is law, for these deputies are always on hand, their guns conspicuous. The new arrival at the ranch will probably be without funds, his resources having been exhausted in getting here. Thus, he must work a second day to pay for his first, and so on. He's continually in debt. He must work." We get a small look at this in the characters of the boss and Curly. When the boys first arrive at the ranch, Candy informs them that the boss is upset that they weren't there this morning, and that he had to send the team out 2 bucketeers short. He then gets on to George and Lenny, suspecting that George may be stealing Lenny's pay. Curly, however, is a lot more aggressive. When we first meet him, he immediately targets the boys, specifically Lenny, for not speaking when spoken to. That's not the end of it, though. As I mentioned earlier, Curly picks a fight with Lenny. Curly was balanced and poised. He slashed at Lenny with his left and then smashed down his nose with the right. Lenny gave a cry of terror. Blood welled from his nose. "George," he cried. "Make 'em let me alone, George." He backed until he was against the wall, and Curly followed, slugging him in the face. By using both of these characters, Steinbeck is able to give us a look at the agricultural scene and how it worked during the Depression. Not only does Mice and Men give us a look into the Great Depression, but it also gives us an idea of what was normal during this time period. For starters, let's talk about one of the few female characters in the story, Curly's wife. When we first meet her, she's described as so. She had full, rugged lips and wide-spaced eyes, heavily made up. Her fingernails were red, her hair hung in little rolled clusters, like sausages. She wore a cotton house dress and red mules, on the insteps of which were little bouquets of red ostrich feathers. As she's talking, though, it's pointed out that Lenny cannot look away from her. When George calls her tramp, Lenny defends her by saying, "She's purty." While the other men don't deny the fact that she's a beautiful woman, their opinions about her are abundantly clear. They call her a tramp, a tart, and even Lulu, to name a few. But what does this say about the gender norms during the Great Depression? Steinbeck does an excellent job of showing us what it was like for women in just a few lines. Just from her entrance alone, we can tell that she's viewed more as an object or possession more than she is a person. This is made even more apparent with the fact that she's known solely as Curly's wife. She's not known as Tracy or Sarah, she's known as who she belongs to. And that speaks volumes. While the Depression put millions of men and women out of work, gender roles didn't change a whole lot from the 1920s. In an article written by Joan Lewis, a women's history writer, she states, "As fewer and fewer women were able to find employment, the societal ideas that had embraced increasing female freedoms did an about-face. Domesticity, motherhood, and homemaking once again became regarded as the only truly proper and fulfilling roles for women. If the woman was lucky enough to find work, she was still expected to take care of the house and the children. She was also expected to look good while doing it." Next, let's discuss Crooks. Crooks is the stable hand on the ranch and the only black man there. Due to this, Steinbeck is able to give us a look into the racial discrimination that occurred during the 1930s. The first time we even hear about Crooks is through a conversation between George, Lenny, and Candy. They discuss the boss, who was upset that George and Lenny weren't there in the morning, and how he took his anger out on Crooks. When George asks Lenny why, Candy responds that Crooks is black. It's revealed here that Crooks has a crooked back due to a horse kicking him. Similar to how Curly's wife is addressed, the fact that everyone calls Crooks Crooks instead of his actual name says a lot. Crooks is only seen by his physical traits, i.e. his crooked back and his race. In another scene, Lenny shows up one night at Crooks's room. While everyone else sleeps in the bunkhouse, Crooks gets his own room, in the harness room, at the back of the barn. When Lenny asks why he can't come in, Crooks replies as, "Well, I got a right to have a light. You go on and get out of my room. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse and you ain't wanted in my room." "Why ain't you wanted?" Lenny asked. "'Cause I'm black. They play cards in there, but I can't play 'cause I'm black. They say I stink. Well, I'll tell you, all of you stink to me." It's these couple lines that really show us how Crooks is treated on the ranch. It's clear that the others don't respect him, especially Curly, Curly's wife, and the boss. While in Crooks's room, Candy stops by looking for Lenny. The three of them begin talking about the farm when Curly's wife drops by. She goes on about none of the guys wanting to talk to her all the way to Curly and his broken hand. Candy, having enough of her rubbish, takes a stand and begins to argue with her. Curly's wife argues back, saying that they're all stiffs, and it's here when Crooks takes a stand. He tells her to get out of his room, that she has no right being there, and he also says that if she doesn't leave, he's going to talk to the boss about making sure she's not allowed in the barn anymore. Curly's wife responds as so. She turned on him in scorn. "Listen," she said, "you know what I can do to you if you open up your trap." Crooks stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down on his bunk and drew in onto himself. She closed in on him. "You know what I could do?" Crooks seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. "Yes, ma'am." "Well, you keep your place, then." "I could get you strung upon a tree so easy, it ain't even funny." Crooks had reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and his voice was toneless. During the 1930s, racism and discrimination were still a prevalent problem. According to an article titled Race Relations in the 1930s and 1940s, it says, "In some northern cities, whites called for African Americans to be fired from any jobs as long as there were whites out of work. Racial violence again became more common, especially down in the South. We see this type of behavior in the book, especially during that last scene I mentioned. Crooks actually retreats in on himself at the mere thought of Curly's wife saying anything to the boss about him. All she would have to say is that he had an attitude, and he'd immediately be lynched. Steinbeck uses Of Mice and Men to give us a look into the agricultural scene during the Great Depression. From George and Lenny all the way to Crooks, we get a unique look at how the Depression affected everyone. Because of this, we're able to learn about what was normal during those times. As I mentioned with the gender and racial norms, this book doesn't fight the norms of the times, it embraces it. Steinbeck isn't saying the place for a woman should be the home. He's saying many people can't find work, which results in most, if not all, women staying in the home. Megan Schadat points out that the reviews for the book were extremely positive and consider the new novel well up to par with Steinbeck's previous novels. The book itself is a short yet simple read. It reads like a play and has vivid enough imagery to actually be able to visualize where the characters are. While most of the reviews were well received, a couple of people had a few problems with how certain aspects of the book correlated with biology. Edmund Wilson once criticized the book, saying, Steinbeck's preoccupation with biology led him to present life in animal terms. Wilson, along with many others, believed that Of Mice and Men was a simple social representation of Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest. He believed that Lenny had to die because he represented the weakest part of society, which was unfit to survive. Part of this is due to the ending of the book. Yes, Lenny did die, but not as a representation of society or biology, but rather as a representation of life. However, in reality, life can be cruel, and the American dream that both George and Lenny seek just isn't achievable. Now that we know how it was held up when it was first received at first published, let's take a look at how Of Mice and Men holds up today. Jack Sands, an editor and educator of psychology, says that most people recognize that the story describes how easy it is for best laid plans of mice and men to often go astray. He continues with, most forget that failure is the best teacher. As I mentioned earlier, critiques of the book believe that the book was a representation of biology's survival of the fittest. Today, however, Sands believes that part of it is a representation of capital punishment. He says, for many centuries, the non-neurotypical folk were placed in prison with the worst criminals, purely because they did not act the same way or they could not learn the customs quickly enough. However, back in the 1930s, criminals were typically hung for their crimes, and we see that in the book. While Lenny is running away, the other men at the ranch immediately set to forming a lynching party. Others say that the whole book is an allegory for men and women who still have dreams or plans they wish to achieve. In an article titled Why Of Mice and Men is Still Relevant, it states, although the novella is clearly dated, the message is what makes it a classic tale. There will be times of plenty and times of poverty. You don't have to have lived through the Great Depression to understand it, nor do you have to have lived through a period of matter-of-fact racism to understand it. This article also discusses how the other themes help the book stay relevant. The isolation and social illusion of different groups is still a topic that is as relevant today as it was in the 1930s. Steinbeck took inspiration from the Depression itself, and that shows in the book. The themes and the message of the book can still be applied to today because of that. Overall, that's one of the reasons why I like this book. John Steinbeck does an amazing job of showing us what it's like to be a part of the agricultural scene during the Great Depression. We get to see what it was like for the workers, like George and Lenny, who just want to settle down and stop wandering, to what it was like for the women, like Curly's wife, who was tired of sitting around at home, to what it was like for the African Americans, like Crooks, who had his own room just because no one wanted him around. But most importantly, we get to see what America was like during one, if not its most vulnerable moment. And I think that's awesome.